This summer will mark 50 years since the release of Blessed Pope Paul VI's encyclical Humanae Vitae. The highly anticipated document translates to "of human life." The document strongly reaffirmed the Church's constant teaching on the regulation of birth, condemning birth control. The encyclical's anniversary is paired with news that Pope Francis will canonize Pope Paul VI a saint, likely sometime this year. Though often deemed controversial, many have also called Pope Paul VI's writings in Humanae Vitae prophetic. I spoke earlier with Father Anthony Doe, the spiritual director at the Venerable English College in Rome. He's also a licensed psychotherapist who frequently writes and lectures on human sexuality. I asked Father Doe to take us back to 1968 and give us some context to the culture's questions on human sexuality that Humanae Vitae addressed upon its release.
Well, I think it's important to put it in a kind of historical context. It was in 1968 that Pope Paul VI published his encyclical, and we must remember that this came after 20 years of a lot of sort of social changes. In the immediate post-war years, certainly in Europe and the United States, there was great austerity, great hardship, and great suffering. But then, towards the end of the 50s and into the 60s, we saw the development of a kind of new culture based on prosperity and affluence, and this created a new cultural change where people were putting emphasis on sort of possessing, enjoyment, free time, excitement, some of one could say almost the hedonistic tendencies that we have now established themselves in our culture. And this came alive, you see, in the early 60s. And it was at that time that the contraceptive pill, was gaining, you might say, quite a lot of support. And it fitted in, or came into the center of that new culture of basically sort of enjoyment and pleasure and really sort of self-centeredness.
Father, you are a therapist and a spiritual director. How have you seen the effect of our sexual culture on the psychology of young people who are still developing?
Well, this, of course, has been one of the most damaging aspects of this hedonistic culture, which really took off in the 1960s, because it's really placed sexual pleasure and gratification, you might say, really at the center of an interpretation of love and relationships, and has now become viral through the internet and, obviously, as we know, the development of pornography and the insistence, you might say, of interpreting fulfillment and happiness in terms of sexual gratification, which has had an enormous effect, particularly on young people. And we see this certainly in the Western world. What it means is that they become sort of addicted and encased in a purely physical interpretation of happiness, of development and growth, which of course has taken them away from the deeper aspects of maturity, spiritually, and in terms of a deeper understanding of love.
Absolutely. Father, 50 years later, what do you believe is the teaching of Humanae Vitae that we need to hold on to today?
I think we've got to, once again, drawing on the whole spirit of new evangelization and the wonderful insights that St. John Paul has given us in his theological reflection of sexuality in the body, we have got to, once again, revive within the Church an true understanding of the meaning of love, the meaning of the fulfillment of love, which is in self-giving, self-gift, self-sacrifice.
Such powerful reflections. Father Anthony Doe, the spiritual director at the Venerable English College in Rome. Again, thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thank you again to Father Anthony Doe for his insight. To continue this conversation on Blessed Pope Paul VI's prophetic work with Humanae Vitae, I was recently joined by a panel of trusted Catholic experts for their thoughts. Dr. Matthew Bunson is a historian, theologian, and senior contributor to EWTN. Mary Rice Hasson is the director of the Catholic Women's Forum at the Ethics and Public Policy Center. Thank you both for being back and joining us for this.
Great to be with you.
Matthew, can you put Humanae Vitae into some historical context for us? How was it received when it was first released?
Well, as the Church has always done, when facing new technologies with earth-shattering developments, she brought her wisdom to bear on important questions. In this case, the scientific breakthroughs of the 20th century relating to things like contraception. Pope Paul VI received a report from a commission that had been established regarding contraception, and it was not a unanimous decision. And one of the reasons that he wanted to issue Humanae Vitae was to bring the clarity of the Church to what was, he knew, going to be a fundamental issue for our times. The reception of it, of course, was complicated because of the levels of dissent, but also of anticipation on the part of a lot of theologians that somehow the Church was going to change her mind on what had really been an unchanging teaching.
Mary, in his writings, Pope Paul VI warned artificial methods of birth control will lead to the lowering of moral standards and lowering of respect for women. 50 years later, was he right?
Absolutely. And I think not to be lost in this discussion is the realization that Humanae Vitae put out a positive teaching. You know, it taught the Church and clarified for all of us the connection between love, sexuality, marriage, and how beautiful that is. So when you disconnect that, what you see is that sex becomes just an individual pleasure-oriented thing, and so it leads to loss of self-respect, but also man's lost respect for women, because women become a thing to be used. And that is clearly what we've seen, just all the sociological evidence. And women know that because regret is so strong. Regret, over 50 years, women still regret being treated like an object because we're not made for that, we're made for love.
Absolutely. As he is canonized this year, very exciting news. What do you think Pope Paul VI's legacy will be?
Pope Paul VI, soon to be Pope Saint Paul VI, was a prophet for his time. We have just been talking about how searing his predictions were in Humanae Vitae regarding the creation of a contraceptive culture. A culture that not only is bringing about the objectification of women and low fertility rates, but is also threatening to bring the imposition by the state of a contraceptive culture. All of these things he saw. And so he is truly a saint for our times in predicting so many of the things that have come to pass, but also things that we can already see coming down the road.
Absolutely. Mary, we have this deep understanding of human sexuality in our Catholic faith. How do we share that message with those who don't share our faith?
You know, I think there are two avenues, and one is sort of the natural level, just health, and 50 years of a contraceptive relationship or relationships and seeing what that has done in our culture. We see physical ramifications, we see women with high rates of depression, so we see the impact.
It's there.
And so you can tap into that and encourage people that there's another way, there's something better. But I think the second way, besides the physical and sort of natural, is just realizing that everyone wants love, right? And love means you're not treated like an object. So we've got to put back together love, sexuality, and marriage.
And we can all sense that. We can all sense that we are worthy of that love. Finally, in your opinion, how significant is it we will see Blessed Pope Paul VI canonized 50 years after he released Humanae Vitae?
Well, we know that Pope Francis has announced that in this year, Pope Paul VI will be canonized, one of a number of popes of the 20th century who will be have been declared saints, or probably will be. It's a lesson for us, though, to heed the words of these saintly modern popes regarding where we are as a civilization and where, as Catholics, we can go to help build that civilization of love.
I think it reminds us that God is truth, and truth is eternal. And so 50 years is a short time, and really it just reminds us that the truth that the Church teaches is something that stays with us forever, and the dissent and the bumps and the difficulty receiving that is temporary.
We can still look back to his writings 50 years later. Dr. Matthew Bunson, Mary Rice Hasson, thank you both for being here.